How long does an actual sword fight last? Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now this is a topic I've actually been meaning to make a video about for quite some time, but lo and behold a quote came up on That Works channel, which is a channel on YouTube I highly recommend. It's very entertaining and I watch it every now and again myself. And this really plays into the topic of this video, and that is that we have gone too far in the other direction when trying to re-educate people about how long real fights, not just a sword fight, could be a bayonet fight, a knife fight, whatever type of fight, how long do real sword fights last? Now, to set some context early on, the fact is that many people who are used to the movie industry and watching Marvel movies and martial arts movies and all sorts of other type of, Zorro movies, are used to the idea that a sword fight might last a really, really long time. And so for the last decade or more, probably 20 years, a lot of us have been trying to redress that misconception and try and describe to people the fact that fights don't actually last as long as they might do in an average Zorro movie or something, Three Musketeers movie, something like this. But the problem is as is often the case with the internet, people overstate the point and go too far in the other direction. And that's what the That Works team, I believe, have done here. So let's see what they said.
Now, for the little bit that I do understand, traditionally the sword fights would have been very quick, one or two moves and that's about it, not like what we see in Hollywood. Is that right?
That is about right throughout history and throughout geography. That is not unique to Japan either.
So really, does a sword fight only last one or two moves? Well, ultimately, I think the problem here is that a lot of people view sword fights as something which never happens anymore and it's practically relegated to movies, fantasy, some books, this kind of stuff. But the fact is that a number of us, as well as training swordsmanship several times a week and having done that for more than 20 years in my case, and some people much longer, the fact is that as well as having being subjected to actual swordsmanship training in European and Asian and other systems, the fact is we study period sources. And do you know what? Period sources actually tell us all about real sword fights, real things that happened. Now, if we were talking about knife fights or gun fights, everybody would look at the modern world, but we can't do that, so we have to look at historical sources. And here are some books that describe real knife and sword fights. There are lots and lots of them, and they contain lots of accounts of original duels and original fights. Not just duels one-on-one, because I know some people will go, oh, there's a big difference between, self-defense or a skirmish or a battle or a duel. Yeah, that's absolutely true. And so there's actually a spectrum. So to answer the question, this is Matt Easton being concise for once. To answer the question, how long does the sword fight last? Well, how long is a piece of string? How long does any fight last? How long does a knife fight last? How long does a gunfight last? The fact is, yes, indeed, in some situations, it can be one or two actions. It can be over very, very quickly. However, lots of fights weren't, and this is the problem. Lots of people have overstated in trying to get away from the Zorro or the Three Musketeers movie idea of a sword fight going on for 5 minutes through several rooms or across a whole landscape. In trying to get away from that idea, they've overstated it and they've pointed at maybe one or two fights from Akira Kurosawa movies, which are like one or two moves, and they've gone, yeah, that's a real sword fight. That's what all real sword fights are like. No, we can't make categoric statements like this about all sword fights. Some sword fights lasted a really long time, and we've got literally historical examples of those, okay? As a basic example, I want to remind you that in the Viking era, if we go far back, in the Viking era, duels were allowed to expend 3 shields. That's right. In a sword fight in the Viking era, they were expected to possibly get through 3 shields. Now, that's quite a lot. To get through 3 shields, that doesn't happen in 1 or 2 moves. Okay. Equally, if we now fast forward all the way to the 19th century, we've got many very explicitly described fights with swords and bayonets and tomahawks and all sorts of other things, cutlasses. And some of those fights lasted quite some time. Equally, we've got a whole bunch of examples from the fencing treatises, if we look at Donald MacBain's works, where there are many descriptions of people surviving numerous cuts. We've also got examples of that from war. And this is one of the underlying points and one of the reasons why most sword fights are not over in 1 or 2 moves. And that's because, newsflash people, swords aren't magical. Swords aren't lightsabers, and swords aren't a instant kill switch that when you switch it, the other person stops being alive. The fact is that sword is just a long blade, okay? Whether you're thrusting or cutting with it, it very, very rarely kills instantly. Just in the same way that bayonets don't usually kill instantly and knives don't usually kill instantly. There are only very specific biological effects on a person's body that means that they will die instantly. Even people who are shot don't usually die instantly. And in fact, many people who are wounded with a sword will continue to fight for quite some time and they might win. Equally, they might survive, the fight might be over and they might survive for the rest of their natural life. So the fact is that swords aren't kill switches, they are just a bladed implement with a longer blade than a knife. So, how long does a sword fight last? Any amount of time, potentially, but we must get out of this mindset of fights only lasting 1 or 2 moves, because that is pretty much almost as incorrect as the opposite, as the very long movie Hollywood screen fights that we see in classic movies and even modern movies. They are both equally inaccurate to probably what is the average sword fight. So let's just give a couple of examples of the extremes of these historical accounts which describe sword fights, sometimes which are quick, sometimes which are not quick. And so first up, we're going to look at a quick example. This is from Blades of the British Empire by D.A. Kinsley. And this is an account of a duel between Lieutenant General Sir Hatton Cheek and Captain Sir Thomas Dutton. And this occurred on the beach at Calais in 1610 as a result of personal disagreement. And I should also point out that this is being taken from a history of Great Britain dated 1653. So this is a almost period sources from a generation or two later. I quote, "Stripping to their shirts in a cold morning, they ran with that fury on each other's swords, as if they didn't mean to kill each other, but to strive who should die first. Their weapons were rapier and dagger, a fit banquet for death. At the first course, Cheek ran Dutton into the neck with his rapier and stabbed him in the neck backward with his dagger, miraculously missing the windpipe. And at the same instant, like one motion, Dutton ran Cheek through the body and stabbed him into the back with his left hand, locking themselves together thus with 4 bloody keys, which the seconds fairly opened, and would fain have closed up the bleeding difference. But Cheek's wounds were deadly, which he, finding, grew the violenter against his enemy, and Dutton, seeing him begin to stagger, went back from his fury, only defending himself till the other, rage weakened with loss of blood without any more hurt, fell at his feet. Dutton, with much difficulty, recovered from his dangerous wounds, but Cheek, by his servants, had a sad funeral, which is the bitter fruit of fiery passions." And I have to say there are many, many accounts, particularly in the age of the rapier and the subsequent small sword, of duels that were like this. They were passion-led duels where 2 people charged on each other with thrusting weapons, ran each other through, sometimes several times, sometimes grappling, falling to the ground, stabbing multiple times. So could we say this was over in 1 or 2 moves? Well, this is an example of an incredibly aggressive, violent encounter where nothing was held back, no time was wasted, but both people in some cases killed each other, or sometimes by luck one survived. So, you know, I think it's undermining how many things happened in these sorts of fights to say it was over in 1 or 2 moves, as if describing one person being uninjured and the other person being dead. In these very quick encounters, very often both people came out gravely wounded, and sometimes, as I say, both died. So here is a rather long account that wasn't over very quickly at all, and this is taken from the life of Edward Lord Herbert of Cherbury, written by himself in 1770. And Sir Edward Herbert, first Lord Herbert of Cherbury, this is him describing his duel with Sir John Ayers, who was a government agent and official. And that duel happened in London in 1611, and there was the result of Ayers having falsely accused Herbert of having whored Ayers' wife. He says, "Finding he could take no advantage against me, in a treacherous way he resolved to assassinate me in this manner. Hearing I was coming to Whitehall on horseback with 2 lackeys only, servants, he attended my coming back in a place called Scotland Yard," later famous of course for the police headquarters, "at the hither end of Whitehall, hiding himself here with 4 men armed on purpose to kill me. I took horse at Whitehall Gate, and passing by that place, he being armed with a sword and dagger, without giving me so much as the least warning, ran at me furiously. But instead of me, he wounded my horse in the brisket, as far as his sword would enter for the bone. My horse, that hereupon starting aside, he ran him again in the shoulder, which, though it made the horse more timorous, yet gave me time to draw my sword. His men thereupon encompassed me, encircled me, and wounded my horse in 3 places more." Horses are tough. "This made my horse kick and fling in that manner, as his men durst not come near me, which advantage I took to strike at Sir John Ayers with all my force, but he warded the blow both with his sword and his dagger, and instead of doing him harm, I broke my sword off within a foot of the hilt. Hereupon some passenger that knew me, and observing my horse bleeding in so many places, and so many men assaulting me at once, and my sword broken, cried to me several times, 'Ride away, ride away!' But I, scorning a base flight upon what terms soever, instead thereupon alighted," got off my horse, "as well as I could. I had no sooner put 1 foot upon the ground, but Sir John Ayers, pursuing me, made at my horse again, which the horse perceiving, pressed on me on the side I had alighted on, in that manner that he threw me down, so that I remained flat upon the ground, only 1 foot hanging up in the stirrup, with that piece of a sword in my right hand. Sir John Ayers hereupon ran about the horse, and was thrusting his sword into me, when I, finding myself in this danger, did with both my arms, reaching at his legs, pull them towards me, till he fell down backwards on his head. One of my footmen hereupon, who was a little Shropshire boy, freed my foot from the stirrup, good servant. The other, which was a great fellow, having run away as soon as he saw the first assault, this gave me time to get upon my legs, and to put myself in the best posture I could, with that poor remnant of a weapon in his hand." So he's now trying to continue the fight with a broken sword. Sir John Ayers by this time likewise had also got up, standing between me and some part of Whitehall, with 2 men on each side of him, and his brother behind him, with at least 20 or 30 people of his friends or attendants of the Earl of Suffolk. Observing thus a body of men standing in opposition to me, though to speak truly I saw no swords drawn, but that of Sir John Ayers and his men, I ran violently against Sir John Ayers, but he, knowing my sword had no point left, held his sword and dagger over his head, as believing I could strike further than thrust, which I no sooner perceived, but I put a home thrust to the middle of his breast, that I threw him down with so much force that his head fell first to the ground and his heels upwards. His men hereupon assaulting me, when one Mr. Mansell, Glamorganshire gentleman, finding so many set against me alone, closed with one of them, grappled. A Scotch gentleman, also closing with another, took him off also. All I could well do to those 2 which remained was to ward their thrusts, which I did with that resolution that I got ground upon them. It goes on. Sir John Ayers was now got up a 3rd time, when I, making towards him with the intention to close, thinking there was no other safety for me but by a thrust of his with my left hand, and so coming within him, received a stab with his dagger on my right side, which ran down my ribs as far as my hip, which I, feeling, did with my right elbow force his hand, together with the hilt of his dagger, so near the upper part of my right side that I made him leave hold, or let go. The dagger now sticking in me, Sir Henry Carey, afterwards Lord Falkland and Lord Deputy of Ireland, finding the dagger thus in my body, snatched it out. That was nice of him. Thus while I, being closed with Sir John Ayers, hurt him on the head and threw him down a third time, when, kneeling on the ground and bestriding him, I struck at him as hard as I could with my piece, my broken piece, of a sword, and wounded him in 4 separate places, and did almost cut off his left hand, presumably a defensive wound there. His 2 men this while struck at me also, but it pleased God even miraculously to defend me, for when I lifted up my sword to strike at Sir John Ayers, I bore off their blows 6 times, in other words, by accident. His friends, now finding him in this danger, took him by the head and shoulders and drew him from between my legs and carried him along with them through Whitehall at the stairs whereof he took boat, got on a boat and ran away. Sir John Herbert Croft, as he told me afterwards, met him upon the water, vomiting all the way, which I believe was caused by the violence of the first thrust that I'd given him. His servants, brother and friends being now retired also, I remained master of the place, and his weapons, having first wrested his dagger from him, and afterwards struck his sword out of his hand too. This being done, I retired to a friend's house in the Strand, where I sent for a surgeon, who, searching my wound on the right side and finding it not to be mortal, cured me in the space of some 10 days, during which time I received many noble visits and messages from some of the best in the kingdom. So, you know, there is a complete opposite of an immense long encounter between one person and another person, but also with a whole bunch of other people getting involved. And this certainly wasn't over in 1 or 2 moves, and yet very clearly it could have been if it had panned out differently. So this is the point of this video, and this is really what I want you to go away with. Yes, indeed, a fight with swords or any other weapon, be it a knife or a gun or anything else, can be over in the blink of an eye, or it can last a really protracted amount of time based on the context, the circumstances, the weapons, the clothing, the armour, whether there are other people involved, the environment, many things. And particularly horseback fights, you often find, can last really quite a long time because of the nature of the horses moving in and out of distance to be able to hit each other. And of course the ability to run away if things go badly. You can just put your spurs to your horse and make it flee with you. So there we go. I support the people that criticise overly long and showy fights in Hollywood, although remember, that's entertainment, that's fine for what it is. But we don't want to go too far the other way and make out that every single sword fight is over in 1 or 2 moves, because it's categorically not. And I've just given you one historical example there, but there are, if you go through all of these books, there are loads and loads of examples of sword fights which lasted quite some time, and are very rarely where one person cleanly kills another. Usually both people end up wounded, sometimes both people end up dead. I hope this has been enjoyable and thought-provoking. Give us a like and a subscribe if you haven't done already, and I'll see you again soon back on Schola Gladiatoria channel. Cheers folks! Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers folks!